Excellent. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to our continuing lecture series here. Uh, this evening, we're pleased to have Dr. Rachel Bonoan with us. She's an assistant professor in the biology department at Providence College. She recently finished her postdoc research at the Krohn Lab of Tufts University and the Schultz Lab in Washington State in Vancouver on ant caterpillar interactions in South Puget Sound in Washington. So for her PhD, she studied honeybee behavioral ecology, nutritional ecology, and ecological immunity in the Starks lab at Tufts. So she is a wonderful speaker, and she comes highly recommended, and we're very lucky to have her. So join me in welcoming her to the Middlesex County Beekeepers Association.
Thank you for having me. I see some hand clapping emojis. I'm happy to be here. I will share my screen. Well, quote unquote, be here. All right, can you see this slide? Why do honeybees like dirty water?
Yes.
Great. So as Tony said, I did my PhD at Tufts University. I stayed at Tufts University to do my postdoc, which was kind of a weird in between grad school and professor in the sciences. And while I was doing my postdoc, I actually worked out in the Pacific Northwest with the Washington State University lab in Vancouver. During my postdoc, I studied ants, caterpillars, and butterflies. So I stepped away from the bees for a little bit, but I'm really excited to get back into both native bee and honeybee research. So today I'll talk to you about some of my PhD research on why honeybees like dirty water. So I am a beekeeper as well as an ecologist. I started keeping bees for the sake of my PhD research. So I always tell people that the honeybees kind of found me because I had to learn how to keep them to do my research. And then I just kind of fell in love with beekeeping and the whole social aspect of these amazing creatures. So this is me with one of my first swarms. This was from an observation hive that's in this shed here. And they swarmed just on, half of them were just hanging out right below the entrance, the tube's right here, and the queen was in the middle. And lucky for me, my brand new bee suit had come in that day. So that's why it looks so nice and new and clean. And we got the swarm and got the bees. So I've been keeping bees since 2012. And like I said, the honeybees sort of chose me when it comes to the kind of science I do. So I'm an ecologist. So ecology is the branch of biology that focuses on the relationships of organisms to one another and the environment. So already as beekeepers, you pay attention to ecology all the time. And I'm specifically interested in nutritional ecology, which is a branch of ecology that focuses on how an organism's nutritional requirements, foraging behavior, and utilization of nutrients are linked to the environment. So again, as beekeepers, you're all kind of nutritional ecologists, right? You pay attention to what your bees are eating, how much honey they have, the time of year it is, what kind of flowers are around. And so as you can see, honeybees are a really great system for studying nutritional ecology. And I know I don't have to convince you all that honeybees are awesome. But I just want to make a few points on why they're so awesome for studying nutritional ecology. The first is they're called, we call in science, central place foragers. So they leave the hive to collect their food and they bring their food back to the hive. So this allows us to track not only what the bees are eating, but what's actually happening inside the hive, what kind of nutrients the bees themselves are absorbing. And we can look at foraging behavior really easily, right? We can just sit outside the hives and count bees, count who's coming back with pollen, who might be coming back with nectar. And so a lot of my data has been collected by sitting outside and counting bees, which has been a lot of fun. Nutritional ecology can also not only change with seasons, like we see with honeybees, but it can change with age as well. So here we have our adult bees, and their nutritional requirements are a lot different than those larvae that are hanging out below them and developing. So adult bees actually mostly only need carbohydrates for energy, whereas these growing, developing larvae need a lot of protein. And as we know, nutrition also dictates the caste system, right? So a developing queen gets much different food than a developing worker bee and even a developing drone. So nutritional ecology not only is happening outside the hive, but it's happening within the hive environment as well. And then because beekeepers take such fantastic notes and we've been keeping bees for so long, we know what a healthy hive is supposed to be doing throughout the year. So we can track nutrition, what's happening outside, and health, what's actually happening inside the hive. So in the spring, there may be some weedy species around for the bees to forage from. They might just start to get active. In the summertime, we have a big healthy hive with lots of forage around, lots of different wildflowers. And then as we know, the fall, things start to dwindle as the drones get kicked out and the bees switch to overwintering. And there's less forage available to them. So we can track what's actually happening throughout the year in these hives and have an idea of what the baseline should be. And we know a lot about honeybee nutritional resources. They collect pollen and nectar from flowers. So pollen is their main source of proteins, lipids, and trace minerals. And nectar is their main source of carbohydrates and trace minerals. So pollen's like the meat, nectar's like the potatoes. And throughout the year, we know that honeybee nutrition is constrained, especially here in New England. So early spring forage is usually not very abundant unless people don't mow their lawns, which is, we're pushing for less mowing lawns so that bees have these early blooming weedy species like dandelions and clovers to collect food from. But other than that, not that much is blooming. And then honeybee nutrition is also spatially constrained by the way in which we pollinate our crops in the US. So a lot of the large commercial pollination services are done on these large monoculture farms, such as this almond orchard. And while honeybees can fly pretty far from the hive when they need to find food, these almond orchards can be up to the size of the state of Rhode Island. And so you might, as you might guess, any hives that are in the middle of these orchards really don't have any other options than to just collect pollen and nectar from almond blooms. And so they're not getting a diverse diet. And even if almond was super healthy, this probably isn't that great for them. So even if we ate broccoli our entire lives, we wouldn't be that healthy. So I'm really interested in how we can help our bees stay healthy by giving them a more diverse diet, whether that be, you know, springtime in New England or when they're out pollinating in these large monocultures. And that's where this third nutritional resource might come in, and that's water. So I actually, in 2012, was working with an undergraduate student on a completely separate project, looking at thermoregulation in honeybee hives. And she noticed that our bees were foraging from these really gross looking puddles. At Tufts University, where I did my PhD, the only place they let you keep stinging insects on campus is like behind the gym where facilities keeps all kinds of gross, dirty things. And so our bees seem to really like those puddles. So the undergrad called me really nervous, thinking the bees were going to get sick. I went down there, I checked them out, they looked fine. And I Googled, why do honeybees like dirty water? And it turns out beekeepers had been asking this for a really long time. A lot of beekeepers had noticed that even when they put a clean water source out for their honeybees, the bees tend to go for the swimming pool or the compost pile. I've now heard stories after giving this talk about bees foraging on cow pies at the nearby dairy farm, or a beekeeper in Louisiana told me he dumped his salty water down the driveway after boiling crawfish, and the bees just went crazy for it. So this is not an uncommon occurrence. If you're a beekeeper, you've probably seen your bees foraging for water somewhere where you didn't actually give them a water source. And there was one scientific study on this behavior from the 1940s. And what that study found is that honeybees do, in fact, prefer really dirty water. They preferred water sources made from cow dung distillate, when compared with just regular deionized water. But I wanted to break this down a little bit further. So I dug into this behavior a little bit more, and I thought that maybe honeybees are using this dirty water as a way to get some of those trace minerals that their pollen and nectar may not be able to provide. So honeybees don't need minerals in huge amounts, but they do need some minerals. And if pollen and nectar can't provide those, maybe they're going to water instead. And this is not an uncommon behavior in the animal kingdom, specifically in the insect world. So male butterflies do this behavior called mud puddling, where they specifically visit muddy puddles to get sodium. It's really important for mating in butterflies. Leafcutter ants in the tropics, they'll actively forage for sodium as well. Termites that live underground, they look for soil that's rich in potassium and calcium for their nesting sites. And sweat bees are called sweat bees because of their penchant for drinking salty sweat. And believe it or not, there is a publication on bees that drink human tears, where these scientists literally made themselves cry and then sat outside with their eyes kind of open like this and waited for insects to land on their eyes, and they identified the insects. And more often than not, they had these little tiny bees drinking their human tears. And we all know tears are salty. So dirty water as a sodium or potassium or calcium supplement is not unheard of in the insect world. So it makes sense that honeybees would be doing a similar thing because they're pretty smart. So I hypothesized that honeybees selectively forage in soil and water, or dirty water, for minerals that their main floral diet may lack. So I tested 3 predictions to kind of delve into this hypothesis a little bit deeper. The first prediction has to do with the water itself. I predicted that honeybees will show different preferences for minerals when foraging for water. So we gave them choices of mineralized water and deionized water, which has nothing in it. The second prediction is that if these mineral preferences are in a supplement of the floral diet, they'll differ with the distribution and abundance of floral sources. So in New England, I've mentioned already, we have seasonal differences. In the summertime, there are a lot more flowers available for our bees than in the fall. So we suspect to see differences in water preferences between the fall and the summer. And then lastly, we predicted that the mineral content of the adult bees will be constant over time. So if they're supplementing their floral diet with water, they must be trying to hit some kind of a level, some kind of optimal level that they can stay at throughout the year. So in order to do any of this, we first had to train honeybees to drink from plastic tubes with water in them. And to do this, training honeybees, depending on what time of year you do it in, is actually quite easy. You just put a really concentrated sugar feeder out there for them. So this is just a mason jar with some holes in it, flipped upside down on a plastic plate. And you put it near the hive entrance, wait for the bees to come, and they will do their little dance and tell the rest of their hive, hey, I found this really great source. And then you gradually move that feeder away from the hive until you're where you want the bees to be. So I mentioned that the only place they let me keep stinging insects on Tufts campus was near facilities, and you can see there's kind of like gravel and some weird machinery. And so what we did is we trained the bees to forage beyond this fence and up a grassy hill into a field. So it's a little more of a natural setting to do an experiment in. So we had 8 observation hives, and we did this experiment over 3 years. So every year we had 8 different observation hives. So we had a lot of colonies in this experiment. Now, training honeybees is really easy in the fall. You're not competing with a lot of flowers, and so the sugar you give them is the best they're going to get as far as sugar content goes. So it took a matter of days in the fall for us to train our bees. In the summer, however, training honeybees is quite difficult because they don't really care about your sugar because there's all kinds of other things around. So this is Marlene and Taylor, 2 of my undergrads at Tufts, who Marlene was a biomedical engineering student. So you can kind of see she's built a duct tape bridge to try and coax the bees to our feeder. That did not work. What ended up working actually is putting a small index card or piece of cardboard right on the hive entrance with sugar on it. Once the bees were interested in that, we then moved it to the feeder and kind of coaxed them onto the feeder. But we tried all kinds of things. I had an intern write little notes on our feeders. So this one says, "Bees, please come, thanks, Sal." We even tried scenting the sugar. Tom Seeley swears by scenting his sugar feeders with anise. My bees didn't seem to care about the anise smell. Again, it could have been a time of year thing in that we were just competing with a lot of really good flowers in the area. But eventually we did get them trained to feed at what we call our tasting table. So here are our plastic tubes with different water solutions in them. And what we did is we watched the honeybees forage in this uncovered area and measured volume change here after anywhere 5 to 8 hours, depending on the weather. So we measured volume change in this uncovered area and subtracted volume change in this covered area to control for evaporation. So, and the difference there is what the bees actually drank during our preference assay. And we had at least one person sitting up there for the whole trio to make sure nothing else was drinking our water. So we also had paper wasps visit our feeders, bumblebees visit our feeders, but if they came, we shooed them away. So any volume change is really due to our honeybees that are drinking the water. We did another offshoot of this study where we actually marked the bees with different colored powders to see what colonies they came from as well. And so we had an idea of what proportion of bees at our table were feral honeybees from the area or other bees in the area versus our own bees in the colony. And it was a lot of fun because the facilities workers at Tufts would tell me where they saw the pink bee on campus and the orange bee, and that was a lot of fun. But today I'm just going to present that volume change data as well as some different data on pollen. So we had a few different solutions, well, more than a few. We had 8 solutions at our table here. We had 2 control solutions. So sucrose just kept the bees coming to the table. It's what we call our positive control. And deionized water is what we actually compared volume change to. So that's our negative control. So we're really interested in what bees are drinking of the mineral water compared to that deionized water. And then we had 6 experimental mineral solutions, sodium, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. They're all found in soil. They're all really important for insect physiology. Nitrogen and phosphorus are also found in soil and really important for physiology of pretty much all living things. Sodium and potassium in insects specifically are really important for water regulation and pH regulation. Calcium is important for hardening of the exoskeleton on insects, and it's also really important for muscle movement, which will come up later. And then magnesium is important for immunity in insects, and nitrogen and phosphorus, like I said, they're really important for any kind of cell-to-cell communication in any living organism, as well as waste removal. So these are all minerals I expect the bees to need nutritionally and that I expect to be found in these dirty water sources where we see them foraging. So here's a video of one of our preference assays. This was before I had a good camera, so forgive the quality of the video. But what I do want you to notice is in this top right corner here, you'll see a bee. She lands on the tube and then she kind of samples all the way down the column until she lands on the tube at the bottom and starts drinking. And so it does seem like the bees can tell what's in these vials, in these feeders, even though my mineral solutions were only 1%. So they're really low mineral solutions, but the bees are still able to taste the difference and decide what they want to drink from. So now I'm going to show you some data. So we have data from the fall, which is this light gray, and the summer, which is the dark gray, on Tufts University campus. So this is all in the greater Boston area. And we're going to look at mean volume consumed in relation to that deionized water. So this thick black line here, that's our baseline. Anything above the baseline is what bees preferred compared to water. and anything below it is what they avoided relative to water. And then we have our 6 minerals down here on the bottom. Again, the sugar was just to keep them coming. We know bees love sugar, so we didn't really look at that when we're looking at these mineral preferences. So when we look at our fall data, we can see that bees do in fact have mineral preferences. They really love water with sodium, which makes sense. Most things that eat plants are low in sodium because plants are low in sodium. They also really like potassium, calcium, and magnesium relative to water, and they don't seem to care much about nitrogen or phosphorus. When we look at our summer data, we see that the preferences do in fact vary with season. So in the summer, in this dark gray, the bees still love sodium compared to water, and again, that does make sense. But now we see this kind of switch in preferences for potassium, calcium, and magnesium. Now they're starting to avoid those 3 minerals, and they're really avoiding nitrogen and phosphorus compared to water. So yes, honeybees do have mineral preferences when foraging for water, and it does seem that these preferences are varying with the distribution and abundance of their floral sources. So when there are fewer flowers available in the fall, they're coming to our table more than in the summertime when there are more flowers available. And that pattern is even more clear when we look at this switch in preferences and a study done in the 1980s at the USDA Bee Lab in Beltsville, Maryland, shows that these 3 minerals are the most commonly found minerals in pollen, and that their levels do vary with season in the way we would predict them to. So in the fall, there are not a lot of these minerals in pollen that the bees are bringing back to the hive, and they're coming to our table. And the reverse is true in the summertime. So in the summertime, there's a lot of potassium, calcium, and magnesium coming back to the hive on those pollen pellets, and the bees aren't coming to our table. But this study was done in the 1980s in Beltsville, Maryland, and I heard already mentioned that my study was done at Tufts University in the Boston area. And as a nutritional ecologist, right, it's only prudent for me to think about how different areas of the US might have different floral resources available to honeybees. So yes, we did show that that honeybees have mineral preferences when foraging for water. And as far as mineral preferences differing with distribution and abundance of floral resources, we're going to give that a maybe right now because it does differ with what we know based on Maryland data, but we needed to collect our own data to really make our decision there. So to do this, we put pollen traps on our observation hives. And a pollen trap in an observation hive causes a major traffic jam because the entrance is already so small. So what we did is we put these mesh grids as our kind of temporary pollen traps over the observation hive entrance a couple times a week just for an hour or so during the morning when pollen foraging is the most active. And so we had a little tray down here where we collected the pollen pellets that got knocked off the honeybee legs into our tray. So we were able to do this through the summer and the fall to now look at the chemistry of the pollen that the bees are collecting. So the pollen they're bringing back to the hive, what mineral content is in there in the summer compared to the fall? And we looked at pollen instead of nectar, one, because pollen's way easier to collect than nectar. You can collect nectar from returning foragers, but that requires catching a bee and then gently squeezing her till she spits her nectar out, which, as you might imagine, could result in a sting. And we do know that mineral content in flowers and plants in pollen will co-vary with whatever is in nectar. So whatever we find in pollen is also going to be available in nectar, but we also know that nectar just has way lower amounts of minerals than pollen does. And so we're really getting a good idea here of looking at pollen content of what the bees can actually get from their flowers. So we expect pollen content to completely just complement our water preferences. So this is a table to kind of help you visualize that. So in the summertime, we see that the bees compared to deionized water kind of avoided calcium, magnesium, and potassium, and they really loved sodium. So that's what our arrows are showing here. Down means they avoided it. Up means they really liked it. In the fall, they really liked all of these minerals, specifically sodium. You'll notice that nitrogen and phosphorus are missing. That's because the chemical analysis we did with the pollen just made it really difficult to get reliable nitrogen and phosphorus data. So we focused on these 4 nutrients. So our predicted pollen content is we predict to have relatively more pollen, that the bees, more minerals in the pollen the bees are bringing back to the hive for calcium, magnesium, and potassium in the summertime. In both seasons, we expect there to not be much sodium at all because there's such a strong preference for our water with sodium. And then we expect to see them start to avoid calcium, magnesium. We expect to see them not to bring as much calcium, magnesium, and potassium back in their pollen in the fall. So when they're coming to our table for these water sources, we expect to see them not getting these minerals from pollen. So now I'm going to show you the mean concentration of these different minerals in pollen over time, and concentrations in parts per million. So it's pretty low, but when you think of the scheme of a honeybee, they're pretty small. And we're looking at this over time. So we started collecting pollen in mid-July, and we ended in late September. So I've broken this up into summer and fall, and we have our 4 different elements. So first, when we look at summer, we can see that in pink here, we have sodium pretty much near 0. So the pollen the bees are bringing back to the hive has no sodium in it, basically, which is what we expect. So plants tend to be pretty devoid of sodium. And in the summertime, our bees are really going for the sodium water. The next line up here, this purple one, is potassium. Potassium's relatively low in the summertime compared to the other minerals. We have magnesium, which is higher here. And then the highest mineral content the bees are bringing back to the hive is that calcium in the summertime. And you'll see there is kind of this up and down over time, and we have this peak in mid-August of calcium, magnesium, and potassium that probably correlates with something new that's in bloom in the area. We do have some data on just surveys of what's blooming in the area over time, but I haven't really had a chance to kind of dig into that data. So we don't know what flowers might be giving these minerals to the bees. But we do know they're bringing this back to the hive in their pollen. So that's the summertime. When we track these levels of bee collected pollen in the fall, we see that there's this huge spike in potassium content in the pollen in the fall. Calcium also starts to be going up, which was not expected. And then we have sodium down here just staying pretty flat at 0, and magnesium is lower in the fall than it was in the summertime. And so this huge spike in potassium was unexpected. The undergraduate who's doing the research with me actually ran that sample multiple times because he thought it was his fault, but it was not. It was a real data point. And we also didn't expect to see as much calcium in the bee collected pollen as we did in the fall. And so the bees seem to be getting quite a lot of potassium and calcium in their pollen in the fall, and they're still coming to our table to drink the water with potassium and pollen. I'm sorry, potassium. Yes, they're drinking the water with both potassium and calcium, as well as getting potassium and calcium from their pollen. So they're getting it from 2 sources in the fall. So I'm just going to run down now this table of predictions. So we found that pollen content sometimes complements water preferences. So in the summertime, we observed that calcium levels were pretty high, and this is when the bees avoided water with calcium. Same thing for magnesium. Potassium was actually relatively low in the summertime, and sodium, as expected, was really, really low in the pollen. And so just in the summertime, we have this one expected result in that the bees don't really seem to be going to water with potassium, and they don't really seem to be getting it from their pollen. So maybe they don't really need that much potassium in the summertime. In the fall, we see an unexpected result with calcium, and that the bees are getting calcium both from the water and from their pollen. So it's not a complement, but it might be in addition to. Magnesium was what we expected. It was relatively low in the fall. Potassium, like I said, was really high in the fall. And so again, this isn't a complement, but it could be an addition. So the bees are getting calcium and potassium from both water and pollen. And sodium just remains super low in plants. Again, this is completely expected and not surprising. And it's always nice when you get what you expect in science. But it's often more interesting to kind of dig into these unexpected results. So mineral preferences, I would say they do differ with the distribution and abundance of floral resources, but it depends on what minerals we're talking about. They might not all be complements or supplements, but they could be an additive. So maybe in the fall, the bees are actually limited by that calcium and potassium, and they will look for that wherever they can, whether that be water or pollen. So that brings me to the third prediction about the bees themselves, is that mineral content of the adult bees will be constant over time. So again, we expect the bees to kind of have this optimal level of minerals that they're trying to hit, and they stay at that level throughout the year. So to do this, we actually diverted our energy from our observation hives to our Langstroth hives. So the dirty water assays and the collection of pollen were all done with observation hives, just because it's easier to manage when we're trying to do a lot of colonies at once. And we were able to mark them to look at different colony preferences. And we also did some tracking of health within the observation hives, so we could measure brood area quite easily without disturbing the bees. So all of the dirty water data and pollen data was collected with our observation hives to collect the bees to actually look at if they have this optimal mineral content. We looked to our Langstroth hives, because when you sample 15 bees from a Langstroth hive, it makes a much smaller difference than when you sample 15 to 20 bees from an observation hive. So we had 3 Langstroth hives that we sampled 15 bees from every week, starting in June and going all the way through October. So we have a really good data set of what the mineral content is of the bees themselves throughout the year. And I just want to mention, so the chemistry we did to get the mineral content of the bees themselves, we did have to kill the bees, unfortunately, but again, 15 bees from a big Langstroth hive, not a huge deal in the scheme of things. And we did sample bees from the brood area. So we got some of those really young nurse bees that are kind of the key to colony health when it comes to taking care of the young. So we collected bees throughout the year from our Langstroth hives, and we did chemical analysis of the total bee. So there could be some stuff in our analysis that might not have been digested, but may have been ready to be excreted at some point. And so we could rerun this, sampling both bees as well as bee poop, which we all know, we've seen and know how to identify, to see what they're actually digesting. Well, this was our first step. So here we have mean concentration again in parts per million, and we have calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium. Again, we're not looking at nitrogen and phosphorus because it's just hard to do with the chemical analysis we were doing. And before I show you any data, I'm going to orient you to our x-axis here. We have time, so we're looking at July through November now. And our y-axes, the concentrations are all so different for these different minerals. So you can see potassium ranges from 25 to 40 parts per million, where magnesium ranges from 3.5 to 5. So the bees themselves have very different amounts of these minerals in their bodies. And if you look at magnesium and sodium first, you can see that bees don't have a constant mineral content at all over time. There's a lot of up and down. It looks like we have a peak in August of both of these minerals. So something's around that the bees are able to forage and get their minerals from, but nothing's constant here. In potassium, we also see a lot of up and down, but we see that the levels are a lot higher than we're seeing in sodium and magnesium. And so it seems like bees need a lot more potassium than they need magnesium and sodium for one reason or another. The most interesting result we found was the calcium content of adult bees stayed relatively low and stable through late October. And then we had this huge spike in calcium content of the adult bees late October and into November. And what's really cool about this data is that Heather Matilla's work at Wellesley has shown that when the bees start to prepare for the winter time, they start raising winter workers late August, early September, and the hive kind of slowly grows their winter worker population until it's about 100% winter workers in late October. And so it looks like these winter workers are the ones that we're sampling in October, whereas throughout the year we have kind of those more summer, spring workers still hanging around. So it's likely that this spike in calcium correlates with the winter worker population in the hive. And we did go back and look at our data, and this was when our hives kind of just were no longer creating any brood at all around mid to late October. So we see this huge spike in calcium content in the bees themselves in the fall. And we know from our foraging data, they're getting calcium from the water and from the pollen. And they're also getting potassium from the water and from the pollen in the fall. You can see their levels are pretty high, but the pattern is just not as stark and clear there. So if you think back to the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned that calcium is important for muscle movement. And as we all know, our bees right now are in their cluster, keeping the hive warm. And the way they keep their hive warm is by actively vibrating their muscles to generate heat. So here we have a thermal image of a winter cluster, and we have the queen in the middle. And so it's likely that the honeybees are storing and collecting more calcium in preparation for this task that's going to be really intense on their muscles. So in preparation for generating that heat in the hive. And while we do know that bees store more macronutrients, so carbohydrates from nectar and protein from pollen, they store more of those winter workers store more of those than the summer workers, kind of as energy reserves, but we don't know much about micronutrients, those minerals. So this is the first data that really shows how mineral content changes in bees over time, specifically honeybees. So mineral content of adult bees was not at all constant over time, and that was actually a lot more of an interesting result than we expected. So bees in the fall, our honeybees are likely in need of calcium, and they're searching for it wherever they can find it, whether that be in their flowers or in their water sources. So I'm at Providence College now. I'm no longer at Tufts. So I'm really interested in looking at how or if micronutrients and those minerals are important for overwinter survival. So I'm sure you've seen this map of average colony winter loss in New England. This is the Bee Informed Partnership data from last year. I haven't updated it yet. But you can see it's quite variable, the winter colony loss in New England. Rhode Island's doing pretty good. Everyone else is kind of around 40 to 50% over the winter time. So what I'm really interested in doing is doing this chemical analysis in colonies and then tracking the colonies to see how well they do over the winter. So colonies with bees that are high in calcium content, are they more likely to survive the winter than colonies with bees that are lower in calcium content? So that's one thing I'm really interested in doing. It's kind of on hold right now with everything happening in the world and on a college campus. There's only so much we can do with college students right now and getting things set up. So eventually I'm really interested in investigating this question further. I'm also interested in which foragers are actually collecting the water and the minerals. We do know that foragers can specialize in pollen or nectar. And from a study from the 1950s that tracked bees throughout their foraging lifetime, we know that some bees do specialize in water collection. So I think they named her Yellow 52. Yellow 52 foraged for water for her entire foraging career and never anything else. So we do know they can specialize in water foraging. So I'm really interested in paint marking the bees that come to our water feeders and then watching the hive entrances to see who comes back, if they're only carrying water, or maybe they're carrying pollen and nectar later or earlier in the day. So what I'm really interested in is not only which foragers collect these micronutrients, but how might they be able to tell what's in the hive and what the hive needs, and then forage accordingly. So maybe a pollen forager, for example, has a pretty good idea of the minerals the hive needs and might search for water instead of a nectar forager. So these are upcoming research questions that I will be investigating at Providence College, so stay tuned for that. And just a little bit beyond the summary of this research, what does this actually mean for you all as beekeepers and the beekeeping industry? So as you know, honeybee nutrition is super important. Honeybees are really vital to the way in which we pollinate our crops commercially. So I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we have these large monocultures that the bees are tasked with pollinating. And during that time, that's pretty much the only food they're getting. So if it's almond season, they'll be in California. Then they might move up to the Northwest for apple season and around to the middle of the country for other crops, and the cycle continues. These are just a couple of the more common pollination routes. There are way more out there. But as you might imagine, as the bees are pollinating these crops, there's also herbicides being sprayed and insecticides and pesticides. And so the dirty water in these crop systems that the bees might be using to supplement their diets may not be safe for the bees themselves. And if they're looking for weeds to maybe supplement their diet, they're not going to find those either because of the herbicides. And so I'm really interested in thinking about a way in which we can give our bees a healthier or safer dirty water source that can supplement their diet, not only throughout the year, but while they're pollinating these large monocultures. Because there's so much happening with our bees. And I just think if we can keep them healthier from the start, then hopefully they'll be able to deal with other stressors that we can't necessarily control. And so I'm interested in investigating inexpensive diet supplements for hives subjected to these large monocultures. So if almonds, say, are really low in calcium and we know bees need calcium, it's pretty easy to give them a saltwater solution without disrupting the whole commercial pollination cycle. I'm also interested in season-specific diet supplements for managed honeybee hives. So if you look at a honeybee catalog, there's all kinds of supplemental diets available to you. There are season-specific diets that exist, but they don't necessarily take these minerals into account. They mostly think about those macronutrients, those carbohydrates, and those proteins. So I'm interested in how we can keep our bees healthier throughout the year and think about those nutrients that they need in smaller quantities, but are still really important. And then overall, I'm really interested in insect pollinator conservation in general. So insect pollinator nutrition, not just our honeybees, really depends on us and our ability to give them forage and plant flowers. In urban environments, there's just not always the flowers available to them because, pavement, lack of space, etc. So a wildflower field such as this one, this is in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, as you might imagine, will give the bees a chance to get that diverse diet more so than a monoculture. So I'm of the mind, if the bees are given a lot of choices, they're probably going to find what they need. But if we don't give them any choices, then they have a much lower chance. We don't all live in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, though, in these gorgeous wildflower fields, but we can still plant urban pollinator gardens that are really important for our bees and other insect pollinators. So this is a garden that the Tufts Pollinator Initiative planted on Tufts campus in the Boston area. We actually have 3 gardens there that we planted while I was there. And then we also surveyed gardens in the Medford, Somerville area to see what other pollinator-friendly plants are just being planted by the community and what plants these pollinators visit. So what can you do for your bees right now? They're not doing much right now. You can check on them and make sure they're okay. But in the spring, you can give them a supplemental mineral source quite easily. Whether that be just leaving your bird bath to go stagnant, the bees will go for it, and it'll have minerals in it, or giving them a salt lick. So you can buy salt licks that are mineralized, so they have more than sodium in them. You can get them pesticide free. If you just put a salt lick out kind of on an elevated surface, the honeybees will visit it when they need their salt. So you can easily give them a supplemental mineral source. I wouldn't add table salt to water directly, just because table salt has iodine in it as well. So if you get salt without iodine, you could add it to water. They will go to it. I did a 1% solution for my mineral solutions. I wouldn't go more than 3%, just because too much of a good thing might be bad, and we don't want to do that to them. So 1 to 3% of a sodium solution could work, but salt licks work as well. You can also give them diverse floral sources throughout the year. Again, not too easy right now, but you can start thinking about that garden. The Pollinator Partnership has an app called Be Smart, where you can put in your zip code, select the pollinators you want to help, and it gives you plants that are really good for that area. And then the Tufts Pollinator Initiative I mentioned, we surveyed plants in the Boston, Somerville area, the Medford, Somerville area, to see what plants were actually there and what plants the bees were visiting. And this was all pollinators, so bumblebees, honeybees, butterflies, etc. And I can share this link in the chat when I'm done speaking, so you can go read this blog post. But the sum of it is, there are 4 flowers that attracted the most insect pollinators throughout the year. And they're foxglove beard tongue is a spring one, Culver's root in the summertime, cut leaf coneflower, which is this really nice yellow flower covered in bees and insects, is a late summer one. And then goldenrod is just so invaluable for insects in the fall. It's one of the few things that's out that pollinators can get food from. And then lastly, supporting local beekeepers, farmers, and nonprofits are all great things that you can do to support your bees. The Eastern Apicultural Society has this really great Kids and Bees program run by Sarah Red Laird, and she has a fantastic Kids and Bees handbook that I also love to plug, because I also believe that educating our young people about the benefit of pollinators and honeybees can never be a bad thing. So with that, I would like to thank all of my funding sources, you all for having me and coming to this virtual talk tonight, and all of the people that made this research possible. And I would love to take any questions you have. I'm happy to take them in the chat, or if you want to unmute. Do you have a, Tony,
hey,
do you
Rachel.
have a way you want to do it, or?
Rachel, I have a quick question for you. I'm a relatively new beekeeper, and I'm just, as you were taking us through the whole conversation about the sodium, where it was always seemed to be of interest to bees regardless of the time of year. And I understand that during the springtime, obviously the sugar water is of high importance to them as well, because of other options that they have are not, readily available. And I understand, as you had mentioned also, last thing was the iodine in the table salt, et cetera. Would you mix into the sugar water that you're providing as a food source any type of the sodium in there? And if you would, the percentage I've heard from guys much more knowledgeable than I is kind of a 1-to-1, 1 pound to 1 pound, something like that, maybe a little bit more depending upon the time of year. But if you were to do that, what kind of calibration would you put in for the sodium to be there so it's present, so that they get that kind of full nutritional value that you were going through?
Yeah, so as long as you get salt that doesn't have the iodine or iron in it, some has iron in it too. So just make sure it's just sodium chloride. I use sodium chloride in this study. And how I made my salt solutions was just 1% by volume. So it doesn't have to be super precise. You can just do 1% of whatever water you're adding, or whatever final volume you have of your sugar water, of the salt, and they'll go for it and they will love it. But other than that, other minerals are kind of hard to come by, for, at the grocery store or at the ag supply store. But there is one, I think it's Honeybee Healthy. I can't remember who does Honeybee Healthy, but it's a liquid mineral supplement that you can also add to your sugar water, and it has directions on how to add that. The only thing with that is it has a lot of minerals in it, and it's kind of hard to know what the bees need versus what they might not be able to digest at all. And we're still kind of learning. So if you want to add sodium to your sugar water, it would be a 1% by volume solution.
Rachel?
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm holding a container of Himalayan salt, pink salt. Do you know the contents of that?
That one should be totally fine. Himalayan salt tends to not have any other additives in it. So you should be good with that one.
What minerals it excels in?
So that one will have sodium in it.
Sodium.
Yep.
No iodine.
No iodine. Nope. Himalayan salt, it's a good one.
I got it, the big jar over here.
I'm glad you went and found it.
Is it the pink from arsenic in the Himalayan salt?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I need to Google that now.
It wouldn't be arsenic because it would kill us.
That's true. We do eat Himalayan salt. I think it'll be okay. Someone in the chat asked if the salt licks are the same as cattle licks from Ag Supply. Yes, they're the same ones. You just want to make sure they don't have pesticides in them. Some cattle licks have pesticides in them to keep the flies away. So just be aware of that. And there are some mineralized cattle licks as well that will have more than just sodium in them. So they might have calcium and magnesium as well. So usually your Ag Supply store can get those for you. There's an Ag Supply store in Georgia that, after seeing my talk, started supplying more of these cattle licks because beekeepers were really interested in them. So definitely doable. Just put them on an elevated surface. That tends to be what the bees like.
I have one more question.
Yes.
If the bees don't like it, why would they eat it? If there is, for example, iodine and salt in the thing there.
If they don't like it, why would they eat it?
Yeah, why do they eat it? Why do you poison them, since they are free to do what they want?
That's a great question. I often say, the bees know what they need. If we give them choices, right, they're going to find what they need.
Correct.
But there's also a lot of stuff out there, unfortunately, that they come into contact with. Bees are super, I'm sure you've all noticed, they love sugar no matter what. And sometimes that's for a bad thing. So there's been stories about bees making bright red honey because they're foraging on maraschino cherry factory waste, or blue honey from the M&M factory. And I imagine those things don't have very good nutritional value. So I think in some cases they're a little bit like humans in that, too much sugar, we love it, but it's not necessarily good for us.
Right.
But if we give them diversity, then I think they'll be able to balance their diet. I see in the chat someone's asking about Epsom salts. I didn't realize butterflies like Epsom salts, but it does make sense. I haven't tried it with bees. It has magnesium in it. I don't think it would be a problem to try it with bees. Again, it's something we soak our feet in. A bee sting soaked in Epsom salt and warm water is like magic. That's what I found in working with bees. So I would give it a shot. I didn't know that about butterflies, but I'm definitely going to look into that.
Also, Doctor, you mentioned a lot about nectars from different flowers and so on. And the only place I've ever found a lot of information on the breakdown of what is in various nectars is in Australia, in the the study of fat bee, skinny bee.
Yep.
Is there an equivalent source? Is there, because I haven't done a deep dive on trying to find information on that, but we must be testing nectars from different plants and different subspecies. Who's
So
doing that? Where can I find that info?
great question. Fat bee, skinny bee is what I based all of my my experimental diets off of because it had such great information. We're getting there. It's just the chemistry takes time to do. I'm trying to think. The best source that comes to mind for me doesn't necessarily look at the chemistry, but it's Peter Lintner's Gardening for Bees. It's a book. I think it's Gardening for Honeybees. And what he did, he worked at a botanical garden and he just watched the bees forage at all of these different plants and then sampled nectar and pollen to see how much nectar and pollen these plants actually gave off. So it's more of a quantity instead of quality. But it's a really great book. It's organized by season, and then it has a pollen and nectar rating for each plant. So it's really nice. But yeah, there's not a ton of chemistry out there, mostly because it takes time. And the funding agencies want to see bigger research than chemistry. But I think it's super important. And we'll be doing a lot of pollen stuff at Providence College as well. Maybe some nectar too. But we'll see. Yeah, unfortunately, fat bee, skinny bee is, I think, the best resource I've come across as well.
Thank you.
So, Professor, you're going to be back with us in a few weeks to give another talk. And I'm hoping that you could speak briefly about your observation hive setup. You said you had up to 8 colonies going at once. I'm interested in observation hives, and selfishly, I'd love to learn more about what you did to set up for your experiments.
Yeah. So real quick, is it next month? Yeah, next month I'll be talking about protein instead of salt. And the protein was all done with my Langstroth hives. But the observation hives we had, they were 2-frame observation hives, so just one frame on top of another. Which was really great for science because each side had plexiglass and we were able to see pretty much everything happening in the hives. I started beekeeping with observation hives. I love observation hives. They can get a little bit unwieldy because they do like to swarm a little bit more. So I always suggest if you're going to have an observation hive, try to have it somewhere where you don't mind opening it up and maybe getting bees in the room, however that may happen. But a really great resource for setting up observation hives is Classroom Hives. I think it's classroomhives.org. Jeff Murray, who's in the Boston area, I don't know if he still does it, but he was running this nonprofit where he set up observation hives in classrooms, as the name suggests, and at museums and things. And he has done so much work on optimizing his observation hive design and making it not only good for the bees, but helpful for the beekeeper. So he has kind of a modular observation hive that you can slide metal on the top and bottom of the box for the frame, and you can take the one frame off and kind of work it outside of the room. Whereas,
fascinating.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I was in a shed and I didn't mind bees getting in the shed. So we just had ones where the plexiglass was screwed on the front. So we'd have to take all of the plexiglass off to get in there if anything happened. But yeah, I love observation hives. They're a great teaching tool. And I teach a class on insect pollinators at Tufts, and it counts as a natural science credit. So I get a lot of people that aren't necessarily interested, but then I bring them to the observation hives and they are just like in awe of everything and they love bees after that. So I love observation hives. They're fantastic.
Excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, does anyone else have any more questions? Otherwise, we'll shut it down and we'll see Professor Bonoan in a few weeks.
I'm also happy to answer questions via email. And I'm on Twitter as well, if anyone's on Twitter and online. So I'm easy to find and track down if you think of anything else.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much.
Really great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Very important.
Excellent.
Thank
Excellent.
you.
Well, thank you very much. We'll close this down, everyone, for this evening. And our lecture series continues again next Tuesday, where we'll have someone from Wellscroft Fencing talk about bear fencing and electric fencing. So, but until next month, thank you very much, Professor, and have a good night, everyone.
Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks.